Good morning and welcome to the 2021 First Amendment Congress. My name is Andy Moore. I'm the Executive Director of Freedom of Information Oklahoma, and we're so excited to be here again this year. Of course, we wish we were live in person with you. Hopefully, by next year, by 2022, we'll be on the tail side of this pandemic and can safely all gather together. When we started planning this a few months ago, it was during the sharp increase in the Delta wave, and it just feels like over the last 2 years, it is almost impossible to plan anything more than just a couple of weeks out in advance. Nevertheless, thank you for joining us today, wherever you are across the state or the country, in case there's anyone tuning in from somewhere else on the planet. We've got an excellent program for you today. Up first is going to be Dr. Joey Senat from Oklahoma State University, a perennial favorite. He will be sharing his presentation about the First Amendment and you. That means you students, right? How this very important piece of our Constitution pertains to you where you're at today. At 10 o'clock, we will have a panel discussion with David Hudson from the Free Speech Center, Tony Childers from the Oklahoma State School Board Association, and Joey Senat's going to join for that as well, about from what you wear to what you share, the limits of free speech on and off campus. We're going to talk about some specific cases that have been recently heard or in the news that can really illustrate where the line is with our freedoms. And then at 11, we have an excellent panel, which I've entitled, "This Panel is a Riot." It's about how states are legislating around the First Amendment and around free speech, and including a case here in Oklahoma. So we're very excited, and without further ado, we're going to move right into our first panel. I'm going to welcome to the screen Dr. Joey Senat. Hello, sir.
How is everyone? Good morning.
Excellent. Well, we're glad you're here. That reminds me, one of the limits of doing things virtually is that we don't get to see the audience's smiling faces. So if you are watching this from anywhere, if you're on YouTube or Facebook, which is the two places we're streaming this, you can leave comments and they should come through on our end. So if you have a question along the way, if you're watching it as a class, I don't know, pick a designee, ask your teacher, someone to chime in, and you can leave a comment and it should come through on our end so we can answer it. And we'll just cross our fingers and hope that works and that maybe you have questions. Or, Joey, perhaps you will just so sufficiently discuss the content that there won't be any questions. Well, I'm going to step off the screen and share Joey's slides, and then we'll get into it.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I do hope, please, that you will participate. Normally, when we do this in person, it is very interactive with the students. And so please, as I'm asking questions, be bold enough to leave some answers. We hopefully will go through this and explain it to you a little better. So let's get started off here. Do we have any students or any schools participating that are from private schools? Do we have any private schools? That would be the next slide. So the reason I asked this is because the question is, well, does the First Amendment protect private school students from censorship by those students? In other words, what's the difference between those who are at private schools and those who are at public schools? So what public schools do we have represented today? You can type that into the comments so we'll know where we're reaching and who's involved here today. So one of the answer to this is there's a big difference between the First Amendment for public school students and those for private students. The difference being there's no state action when it comes to private schools. And state action is simply the idea that for the First Amendment to apply, there has to be some government involvement in the censorship. So if you're at a private school, it's not a government school. But if you are at a public school, yeah, government, you are at a government entity. So the First Amendment does apply. So let's go to the next one. So first question then is, what 5 rights are protected by the First Amendment? Does anyone know? Did anyone know them all before having studied perhaps for this presentation or for this semester? And students out there and the teachers are being awful quiet on this, because usually uh, in the face-to-face, it gets rather raucous. So as before we get into what they actually are, I'll give you a hint that very few people can actually name all 5 rights. There's one survey that showed that only less than 1/10 of 1% of Americans could actually name all 5 rights. So it protects freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, the right to petition your government about redress of grievances. And then the last one would be, does anybody remember the last one? It's to assemble peacefully. Okay. So those 5 rights each have a lot of cases that go with them to sort of explain then what does that mean. Often I run into people who basically the First Amendment means free speech for me, but not thee. In other words, I'm all for the First Amendment, but I'd sure like to censor someone else whose speech I don't like. So these cases sort of explain and help elaborate on what the exceptions are to the First Amendment, and they are very narrow and very few. So we've gone through those rights. So let's go ahead to the next slide here. So what do you think your greatest threat, the greatest threat to your First Amendment rights would be? The greatest threat, the problem that faces your First Amendment rights, most endangers them. And so that would be basically your ignorance of those rights. It's really easy to take away people's rights when they don't know they exist. And I see this, hear about this at every conference when students start telling me what's going on at their schools. If you don't know that you have a right to speech, to expression, in other words, at your school, and you don't know what the parameters of that are, what the U.S. Supreme Court has said is protected, then it's easy for school officials to tell you, no, you may not say that. And you're none the wiser to it, you're going to go along with it. It's really hard. I understand it's really hard, particularly when you're in high school, but at any point in life, to stand up to people who are in authority and who are in power. The guy wearing the tie and the white dress shirt, who can be sort of intimidating when they're the school official. But you got to know what your rights are. Sometimes they don't know either. They're acting out of ignorance. Sometimes they do know, and they're hoping you don't know. So having some idea of what your rights are and what you can say is the best way to protect those rights. You have to have some education on it. So let's go to the next slide. There are U.S. Supreme Court decisions that deal with your rights. And the first one, for example, in Tinker, is the one where the students, and actually we had one of those, John Tinker, speak at our conference years ago, is where the students were protesting the Vietnam War. And to protest, they wore some black armbands. So why would a black armband be a means of protest? And this is sort of old fashioned. You don't see this much anymore, but people used to wear the black armbands as a sign of mourning, of being, in grievement that you've lost someone. So this was a way of saying we are mourning both our soldiers and the Vietnamese people who have died in this war. And a bunch of students, many students were going to be protesting by wearing these bands. And the principal or assistant principal called them in the previous day and said, if you do this, you're going to be suspended. And that drastically cut down the number of students who were going to do it, who actually participated. Again, as I said, it's difficult to stand up to people in authority. Those students didn't know they would eventually win a U.S. Supreme Court case, but they did. And the court said that even students, right? Students retain their First Amendment rights when they cross through that schoolhouse gate. And by the way, they said teachers as well. Now, your rights are not absolute. So in other words, to be absolute would mean that we could say anything we wanted without some sort of punishment or consequences from the government. So there are things that we can be punished for example, obscenity or libel or true threats and what that actually means, and incitement to illegal action immediately. Those are some areas that you can't say without having some punishment or consequence. However, to say that it's not absolute is not to say that the government can just willy-nilly go out and censor any speech it wants. It can't. Well, so for high school students, if your speech is about a political issue or a social issue or your religious speech, then it is protected on that public university campus. The school said, the U.S. Supreme Court said, even though it's not absolute, school officials cannot censor you solely because those comments related to those areas are offensive to others. In fact, the court said at one point, the fact that you have a viewpoint that's unpopular or that disagrees with other people on your campus, that might start an argument, that might start disturbance. But what the court said it can't, or is when it can be punished, is if it would substantially disrupt or would materially interfere with the order and the educational process, the discipline necessary. So any disruption, no. Substantial disruption, material interference with school activities. Again, because the court said anytime you have a disagreement over, a different idea, that might cause a disruption, but it doesn't rise to the level of substantial disruption or material interference with. So again, simply because what you said about a particular candidate, either supporting or opposing that candidate, other people might disagree, but that is not enough to simply say you're punished. You have a strong First Amendment right to speak up on religious, social, and political issues when you're on your public high school campus. So Bethel is sort of a diversion from that. We were talking about in Tinker the student's personal speech. And Bethel deals with a press conference, a student gathering, one of those assemblies, in which the student was nominating another student for the Student Government Association, student council. And he gave a speech filled with sexual innuendo. And it said stupid stuff like he's a man who's firm in his pants and other nonsensical things. And the students went just nuts in the audience, as you might expect. Well, he was punished, and thinking that he was in the right based on Tinker, this ends up before the U.S. Supreme Court. And the court says, well, the difference between this and Tinker is that the student was at a school-sponsored event, was at a student assembly put on by the school itself. And so it started to draw a distinction between you speaking as an individual and when you are speaking in a forum created solely by the school. So the next case where that comes up is Hazelwood. So if you work for your student yearbook or your student newspaper, you may have heard of Hazelwood. It may have probably been oversold to you as giving school officials absolute authority over your school, the content of your yearbook or your school newspaper, and it does not. It says that school officials can censor for certain reasons. For example, if it's poorly written, if the stories are poorly researched, if they would infringe on someone's privacy. There is a case in the country where a student was writing a story about a lawsuit filed against the school district. And the student tried to interview the school principal and the school superintendent, and all these officials refused to be interviewed. And the school officials then censored the story. Now, this is about a lawsuit that the public newspaper, the commercial newspaper rather, is already published stories on. So this ends up before a federal trial judge who rules in favor of the student. And one of the things the principal had to say up on the stand was, well, yes, I wouldn't have censored it had the student just done our side of the story, just our side of the lawsuit. Well, that's not good journalism, and the court recognized that. So Hazelwood doesn't give them absolute power over your student publication, and it does not require that they censor your student publication. And we had some speakers from Columbus, Ohio years ago, including the principal for the high school, who had chosen not to censor a student newspaper special issue edition when he knew it would be very controversial. Now, the next one, Morse, is the one that we call the Bong Hits for Jesus case, because this young man and some of his friends, this was up in Anchorage, Alaska, the Olympic torch. I don't know if you realize the Olympic torch is brought from the previous site by foot as far as it's possible across to the next site. And so the torch was passing in front of their school. And as it did, these students who had never gotten to school that day, they were on the other side of the street. And as the torch passed, they dropped a banner that said, "Bong Hits for Jesus," whatever that means. So they were suspended for doing this, and they filed suit to challenge that, and made it up to, for example, the Ninth Circuit, which handles the West Coast. And the Ninth Circuit gave them the benefit of the doubt that this was some sort of political message, and said the students won. But the school district appealed, and was the U.S. Supreme Court agreed to hear the appeal and said, no, this was viewed by the U.S. Supreme Court as a reasonably viewed as encouraging illegal drug use. So somehow by reading the words "Bong Hits for Jesus," that was going to encourage students to use marijuana. So I think it's a rather nonsensical statement. The U.S. Supreme Court, in some concurring opinions, did say, though, this could not be used, this ruling could not be used to actually punish students who are speaking for example, legalization of marijuana. And there have been referendums in Alaska on that issue. But they saw this as carving out a little piece from Tinker. And so now if your speech under Tinker, your personal speech, is reasonably viewed as encouraging illegal drug use, then it can be punished. But not if you are speaking on the political issue of legalizing marijuana. Now, the next case, if we can go on, head to that one, that next slide here, is the sort of the Save the Cheerleader case. And it is the most recent decision this year by the U.S. Supreme Court. And this young woman had found out after school, she finds out that she had not been selected for the senior cheer squad. And she went on Snapchat with some of her friends, and she dropped some F-bombs talking about the school. And some of her friends shared that with some other people, and it made its way to the school officials, who then suspended her. So the question becomes, how much control does your high school have over your off-campus speech? So as the slide points out there, the court recognized that if we're going to let school officials regulate both your on-campus speech and your off-campus speech, that effectively includes all your speech. And so if we're going to stop you from saying certain things both on campus and off campus, you would never get to say those things. So the court looked at the idea of loco parentis, which means who's acting as the parent there. And it said something important. It said the responsibility for your off-campus speech normally falls to your parents, not to the school officials. So normally it's your parents who would be upset with you for having a Snapchat in which you dropped a bunch of F-bombs about not being selected to the senior cheer squad. Okay, that normally would not fall to the campus officials. So let's move on to the next slide here. And one of the reasonings the court gave was the idea that we say in this country, I really disagree vehemently with what you're saying, but I am going to defend to the death your right to say that. In fact, I used that saying recently with a faculty member who was from another country who just did not understand that idea. If we disagree with it, we should be able to shut down that speech. Well, that's not the way the First Amendment operates. The First Amendment here is to protect unpopular speech. We don't need it to protect popular speech. Speech that everyone agrees with is not being punished. So the US Supreme Court, in a lot of cases, has recognized that a profound commitment in this country to protect speech that is offensive to the majority. That our idea of the First Amendment is to protect that unpopular speech. So the court here says, school officials really have an interest in protecting that student's unpopular expression to ensure that as we go through generations of students, they understand how that really works, that we're here to protect speech that we don't all agree with. So let's move to the next slide on this. Now, unfortunately, the US Supreme Court said school officials sometimes may censor in some circumstances. So the First Amendment doesn't protect you off campus from all censorship by your school officials, but it gave some examples. So for example, if it's serious or severe bullying or harassment of particular individuals, you're targeting specific people. If it's threats, and again, don't have time today, but we would get into what is a true threat, threats aimed at teachers or other students. Failure to follow the rules concerning online lessons or writing papers or computer use or some other online school activities where the school has given you as part of its school function some activity and said, here are the rules to follow. And also, for example, breaches of school security devices. So it said, okay, these are some examples in which school officials still may censor. Let's move on to the next slide here. But it said in this particular case, the school's interest in teaching this student good manners did not overcome the student's interest in free expression. For example, it didn't prove that her posts had caused a serious decline in teen morale to the point where that had substantially interfered with the school's efforts to have this cheerleading team. Now, remember back from Tinker, the Supreme Court said, yes, they could censor when that speech would likely cause substantial disruption of or material interference with school activities. Well, in this case, the US Supreme Court says the school had not proved that her post did that. So the next slide. So the school's interests were also diminished by several factors, one of which was that she had done this outside of school hours and off school campus, outside of school. She had done this elsewhere. She also had not identified the school or targeted any specific teacher or the cheerleader coach. And she had transmitted this through her personal cell phone. It hadn't come through a school computer, in other words, through her personal cell phone to an audience that was consisting of her friends on this circle of Snapchat friends. So those interests ended up combining to say the student was protected. Let's go to the next slide here. And Justice Alito, in a concurring opinion, he points out, again, coming back to the idea that you are at a government institution, a public school, he pointed out that her Snapchat essentially amounted to criticizing government, a public school, and that if some adult had said those same things on Snapchat, they would have gotten such strong protection from the First Amendment that the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, those state officials would have not even bothered to try to punish that adult. So remember, sometimes and we have to remember this as teachers and even public university teachers, that we are still public employees. And so the question is, by the way, very fact-based. Every case hinges on applying the law to the specific facts of that case. But if a student is criticizing the school or a teacher for policies or actions, then that may well be protected by the First Amendment. So I was gonna, does anybody at this point have any particular instances that have come up at your schools that you would like to bring up? You can start putting them into the comments if you have specific questions about, well, we were told we couldn't say this or we couldn't say that. One quick example would be, have you been told at your schools that you may not wear the little wrist bracelets that say, for example, I heart boobies, which used to be handed out as a way to recognize breast cancer month. So years and years ago, I would hear from students that they were being told they couldn't wear those, students were being punished for it. Well, that was, students were actually punished in another federal circuit, and they challenged it, excuse me, and the federal appellate court agreed with the students and said they were entitled to wear those, that they were not, they were still a social message, that students were protected. We have a student a few years ago at Deer Creek who was told he had to remove his Black Lives Matter shirt. And he had worn it several times to school, and nobody in the administration had noticed. This time they told him he had to take it off. Well, that's political speech. Now, the school officials tried to argue that that was divisive. The ACLU of Oklahoma stepped in to help the young man. That is not divisive. Black Lives Matters is a social political issue. It doesn't matter if it's divisive because some people are offended by it or don't like it. As the US Supreme Court has said, simply having a different viewpoint can cause disagreement. We need to teach students in high school that the First Amendment protects differing viewpoints. And this usually brings up the idea of why it's important to learn these in high school. I'd love to know what percentage of Oklahomans you believe go on to earn a college degree. That would be the next place where you would learn about your First Amendment rights. It's actually only about 25% of our adult population now has earned a bachelor's degree. And I can tell you, even if when students go on to college, they don't necessarily get a class in the First Amendment. They don't get a media law or constitutional law class. It's important then that you learn these in high school. And when we have students growing up K through 12 in public school systems where they're constantly told government can control your speech, government can decide if it's too offensive, you must always be nice to everyone in what you say. In other words, you can't espouse ideas that other people don't like. That's not the way the First Amendment works. And a lot of us are afraid we're raising generations of students who think it's okay for government to control your speech on political, religious, social issues, that you must always be nice to people when you speak to them on those issues. We would prefer you have civil discourse and be nice in that conversation. But the US Supreme Court and our own state Supreme Court have long recognized that sometimes people get angry and say things and are not always nice when they have those kinds of arguments. So, we hope that you're learning by coming to this today, that you're learning something then about what your First Amendment rights are and what that would mean. Now, let's go to an example from another state. This student wore, and this is several years ago, he wore up in Dearborn, Michigan. He wore a T-shirt, and that's a picture of then President George Bush, and it says "International Terrorist." And he had actually worn the shirt several times before. And one day at lunch, a school administrator, recognized it and said, "You have to change that." Well, this young man knew what his First Amendment rights were, and he argued with him. And he actually challenged this in court. A civil liberties group helped him with that. So the question is, does he have a right under the First Amendment to wear that shirt? And so to answer that, you start looking first at, all right, so which of those Supreme Court cases, Supreme Court of the United States, which one of those Supreme Court cases would apply here and why? And what would be the key questions? So you would say, well, all right, my choices are between Tinker, which deals with his political beliefs and expressing those on campus, versus, for example, Hazelwood. And this is clearly not a school newspaper or school publication of any kind. It is not an assembly where he is speaking at. So you would say it's not Morse, it's not encouraging drug use, and it's not off campus. So now you would argue that even the cheerleader case could not possibly apply anyway. Although I would say that if he was wearing that off campus or putting that online, the school certainly could not have punished him for that. So we would go with Tinker. And the question becomes, all right, does his speech, would it likely cause a substantial disruption of or material interference with school activities? And if we go to the next slide, we'll start to see, go ahead and click on one more here. So the federal trial judge applied Tinker and pointed out this is the student's personal political speech. This is not a school-sponsored learning experience. So let's go on to the next one here. So those key questions to the next one would be, all right, what kind of speech is this? And this would be considered pure political speech, just like those armbands were pure political speech in the Tinker case. So could school officials demonstrate then that his speech would likely cause that substantial disruption? And the answer was no. And he had worn it several times and it didn't cause any problems, any disagreements. Remember, the fact that some people might be offended by his speech is not enough. If we go on to the next slide here. And this federal trial judge even said, look, students benefit when they're in an environment where they can express diverging opinions. You learn to tolerate the opinions of others. Maintaining a school community of tolerance includes tolerance of even the intolerant or disagreeable viewpoints. In other words, we don't all have to agree on political, social, and religious issues. And the court ruled in favor of the student and said he was protected in this case to wear that. Now, by the way, there is also another case where a student, and by the way, the student in this case is talking about the Iraq War. That's what he's concerned about. Well, there's a case in another school district somewhere where a student is actually punished for wearing a t-shirt that says "Whack Iraq." So it works both from the left and the right, liberal and conservative viewpoints. Someone's always wanting to censor the other side. Let's go into the next slide. This is a different circumstance. Since we just had Halloween Sunday, sometimes schools allow you to wear costumes for Halloween, maybe on the Friday before or when Halloween falls during the school week. So this young woman, and that's her mom in the background there, she has put condom packages all over her t-shirt. And the question is, does she have a First Amendment right to wear a t-shirt covered in packaged condoms? So let's go on to the next slide here. So again, the question is, which Supreme Court case would apply and why, and what would the key questions be? So is this school supervised learning environment? Is this a school assembly? Is this a school newspaper? Or is she expressing her own views on this social issue? And if we go to the next slide, we'll start to see why she did that. Okay, so she got the idea after watching some MTV commercials promoting safe sex. And she said, look, a lot of my friends are sexually active, and I tell them, if you're going to do this, be safe. Okay. She had friends who had unwanted teen pregnancies, friends who had come down with STDs, sexually transmitted diseases. And her message was, please be safe. And she was allowing students, to her classmates, she was handing out the condoms from her shirt. She had taped them on, and she would unpeel them and hand them out. And the school officials were very upset. Let's go on to the next slide on here. So by 8:30, she had handed out about 50 condoms to her classmates. Let's move on to the next one. And so her mother had actually helped her do this. Her mother works, who is HIV positive, works with AIDS and HIV outreach programs down in Florida, said, I didn't think there's anything wrong with this. She's speaking out to her friends in a positive way about dealing with this problem. That's a social issue. Both of them are talking about, here's our solution. We're trying to get a message across with this costume we're wearing. So let's go down to the next one. So the school suspended her for 3 days for being a class disruption and having an insolent attitude. Now, they later shortened that to 1 day. I don't know that she ever sued, by the way. I can never find more stories about this. But the idea that it was simply a class disruption and having an insolent attitude, those should never survive scrutiny by a federal court under the First Amendment. It would have to be substantial disruption, material interference with. And her having an insolent attitude is not something I would see a court upholding. So let's go on to the next slide here. The principal had said, by passing out condoms, you're acknowledging having sex. Our school's position is abstinence. Now, let's go back to that Morse case for a second, the bong hits for Jesus case. One of the things the school district wanted in that case was the U.S. Supreme Court to agree that any student message that conflicted with the school's position on an issue, any student expression that would conflict with that school's position could be punished. And the U.S. Supreme Court did not agree with that. So the fact that the school's position is abstinence really doesn't matter in this situation. The dress code prohibiting clothing that advocates sex or drugs does not condone distributing condoms on school grounds. That was the principal's idea. Well, advocating for sex, she wasn't. She was advocating that if you are going to have sexual activities, that you do it safely. And it is absolutely insane to argue that students in high school are not sexually active. And normally, if we were meeting in person, for example, over at UCO or at my school somewhere, and we were all together, I would ask you all, how many of you know someone who has an unwanted teen pregnancy in your high school? And most of the hands go up. How many of you know someone who has an STD? And lots of hands go up. So to simply argue that we're going to, act like an ostrich and stick our head in the sand and ignore this problem, the student was trying to do something about it. And I am certain that a federal court would have upheld her right to do that in this case. If not the trial court, then certainly the appellate courts. Let's move on down to the next slide here. And something that would have helped her was when the school board chairman says, students have a right to free speech as long as it doesn't interfere with education. Well, again, it's not any interference, it's material interference with. And the fact that he, as you see in that slide, at the bottom of that slide, I think she tried to make a statement to school that I personally find offensive. And that was really what it boiled down to. The school officials found what she was doing offensive. That is not enough. And by the way, in court, your attorneys would go and look up these kinds of comments that the school officials had made, either publicly in the media or to each other in their emails, had put in text messages to each other, and they look for these things and look for, why is the school doing this? And because they were offended, solely because they were offended is not a justification for that. So let's go on to the next slide here. And as Tinker, I've been sort of paraphrasing parts of this again, and this is important for you to see. Tinker says any departure from absolute regimentation may cause trouble. Any variation from the majority's opinion may inspire fear. Any word spoken in class, in the lunchroom, on campus, that deviates from the views of another person may start an argument or cause a disturbance. But our Constitution says we must take that risk. And our history says this sort of hazardous freedom is the basis for our national strength and of the independence and vigor of Americans who grow up and live in this relatively permissive, often disputatious society. We often argue. That's what Americans do. And we often disagree. But that marketplace of ideas in which we disagree, that's how we come about with the truth, with some consensus. You wouldn't want me deciding for everyone what you all get to hear. I wouldn't want one of you deciding what I get to hear, the viewpoints, the ideas, the expression. So we don't want to put that in the hands of a government official, a school principal, a school district chairman, the superintendent. That's not the way we do things in the United States under the First Amendment. All right, I think we have time. Let's go on to another slide here. So we also have issues where students wear pro-game messages to school. And so does the First Amendment protect that student's right to wear those? And sometimes school officials will say, well, we can't allow them to do this because, they might get beaten up. Well, that is giving power to what we would call a heckler's veto. In other words, the most intolerant people are permitted to physically stop someone else's allowable speech. School officials have a responsibility to protect the student, just as they do, you will find later in life. You will see groups at a protest arguing against each other. You'll notice that the police are simply keeping them apart. They're not stopping one side or the other. As long as they are not violent, they can yell and scream anything they want. School officials have a responsibility to protect that speaker and to punish those who would physically, and that's not then expression. A physical attack on someone is not an expression. So this comes down to a case in which Supreme Court case would you apply? And it would be likely then Tinker, because that is a student's private, religious, social, or political message. And we had a case in Florida where a school principal did not like this kind of speech and got upset with the student and suspended her for wearing these pro-gay messages. Her friends rallied to her side and also began wearing pro-gay messages. And some of them just included rainbows on their backpacks and on their clothing. And the principal kept suspending these students because he was anti-homosexual and he did not believe they should be expressing that in a public school. So the students challenged this in court. And when the school district tried to say that the students had caused the disruption because so many of them had been suspended, the court said, no, the school principal caused the disruption by first violating their First Amendment rights. And he was the one who continued to basically persecute, the court said, persecute these students and suspended so many of them that caused the material disruption. Now, the kicker to that case is, and by the way, the students won money for their attorney fees and for some injury, but the kicker is they then took that school principal and gave him a choice of now going and working in the administration building or teaching. He was no longer going to be a principal. And the kicker is, unfortunately, he began teaching an American government class. So I worry about what the students in his American government class would be learning. If you've one last thing here, by the way, if you don't realize this, the U.S. Supreme Court has also, way back in the 40s, dealing with Jehovah's Witnesses, students of that religion in a school, said you have the right not to stand up and say the Pledge of Allegiance, or to sing the national anthem or stand up when the national anthem. Because it pointed out, remember in the 40s, we had just come out of, at this point, World War II, and the court says, the school system is not here to indoctrinate our students essentially the same way the Nazis did. You have a right, a religious, political right, to not stand up, to protest when that happens at your public school. So we did have an instance of that in a high school here in the state with this semester. The students refused to stand up and eventually got into an argument with the teacher and were arrested. And the school's argument back is now that they were not arrested for not standing up. They were arrested for the argument. So I want to leave you with this. When someone in authority is trying to censor you, and I know it's hard to do this, stay calm. Take deep breaths. Don't argue back. Don't scream back. Stay calm. Because if you do the opposite, if you get into that argument, then your behavior becomes what they try to punish, and it becomes the main issue. Stay calm. Record. You've got cell phones, smartphones. If you've got one with you, record what's happening and then take it to someone. You're always welcome to email me, but I will send you on to, for example, the ACLU of Oklahoma or the Student Press Law Center or even a group called FIRE. And they have attorneys who will step in and try to help you. So if this happens to you, stay calm, record it if you can, and then seek help afterward. And I thank you for joining us, and I hope you've learned something. You're always welcome to email me. If you have questions, you can find me at the OSU directory.
Thank you, Joey. That was excellent as always. I think I say this every year because it's true every year. I learn something every time you do this that either I forgot the last year or it didn't resonate quite the same as it has this year.